This was not a speech delivered to preserve a life. It sounded like words spoken after death had already lost its leverage. Hours after an attempted coup, with the risk of assassination still present, Ibrahim Traore acted in a way no modern African political script anticipates. He did not plead for calm. He did not predict disorder. He did not portray himself as the final barrier between the state and collapse. Instead, he stepped out of the center of the narrative. What followed was not rebellion. It was more unsettling than that. Traoré spoke with the calm certainty of someone who understood a truth most systems work hard to conceal. Leaders can be removed. Ideas cannot be executed. Bullets stop bodies. They do not stop awakenings. Once people understand that power does not reside in a single individual, fear loses its usefulness as a tool of control. This was not emotional bravado. It was structural intent. By stating openly that the movement would continue even if he were killed, Traoré dismantled the oldest method used to restrain African ambition. When killing a leader no longer kills momentum, assassination loses relevance. The logic behind coups begins to fail. Control weakens. That is the moment when power begins to feel exposed. When a leader teaches people how to continue without him, history is pushed onto a course that resists reversal. The surprise was not that Burkina Faso faced another coup attempt. For a country long positioned at the crossroads of insecurity, foreign pressure, and historical fatigue, instability has often been framed as unavoidable. The shock came afterward. In the hours when leaders usually withdraw behind protection and protocol, Ibrahim Traoré stepped forward with words that sought no shelter, no sympathy, and no approval. He spoke as though the oldest threat in African politics had already failed. Across the continent, authority has often been personalized because fear has been personalized. Remove the man, the logic says, and the structure collapses. Assassination becomes strategy. Disorder becomes leverage. Silence becomes control. Traoré did not deny this history. He confronted it directly, then stripped it of usefulness. What unsettled observers was not emotion, but discipline. His words were not centered on survival. They challenged the assumption that survival was the objective. Rather than defending his own position, he questioned the entire framework that turns African leadership into a single vulnerable target. He spoke of breath, blood, and mortality, not to dramatize danger, but to neutralize it. A body can fall, he argued. An idea does not bleed. That was the turning point. The speech was not about bravery in the presence of death. It was about removing death from the equation of power. By asserting that the movement would outlast him, Traoré denied his opponents the outcome they rely on most: finality. Violence works only when it promises an ending. He offered none. In doing so, he shifted authority away from office and toward collective understanding. Power, he implied, is not held by those who command weapons, but by those who recognize their own value. When people grasp that their land, labor, and future belong to them, coercion becomes inefficient. Control grows costly. Fear becomes unreliable. This was not a populist appeal. It was a structural argument. Traoré was not asking citizens to protect him. He was instructing them to stop treating leaders as the final guardians of destiny. In African political history, this distinction matters. Too many movements have collapsed under the weight of martyrdom. Too often hope has been buried alongside individuals. Traoré's message cut through that pattern with precision. The implications of that moment extended far beyond Burkina Faso's borders. A leader who presents himself as indispensable can be isolated, pressured, or removed. A leader who teaches his people that he is replaceable destabilizes the logic of external influence itself. Aid, sanctions, threats, and coups all depend on a central figure through whom pressure can be applied. When that figure dissolves into an idea, leverage weakens. This is why the speech landed less as a plea and more as a warning. It signaled that the familiar script was no longer being followed. The language of fear, punishment, poverty, and isolation had lost its hold. Burkina Faso, Traoré implied, had already suffered. Suffering no longer functioned as a deterrent. A nation that has known humiliation cannot be threatened with it again. Just as important was what the speech refused to do. It did not demand loyalty to a man. It did not ask for obedience. It called for alignment with a future. By framing dignity as a choice rather than a reward, Traoré shifted responsibility outward. The state was no longer a shield protecting passive citizens. It became a reflection of their awareness. This was the quiet rupture beneath the drama. When people are taught that their worth is intrinsic, dependency becomes an insult rather than a necessity. When poverty is understood as produced rather than destined, exploitation loses its moral cover. And when a leader declares openly that his death would multiply voices instead of silencing them, power is no longer centralized enough to be severed. For observers accustomed to African crises being narrated through fragility and dependency, the moment was deeply uncomfortable. It did not sound like desperation. It sounded like preparation, not for survival, but for continuity. That is what made this opening chapter dangerous. Once people accept that no single life stands between them and their future, the oldest methods of control begin to fail. When fear stops working, those who rely on it must adapt or lose their grip. This awakening did not begin with words alone. It had already been tested in action. The real weight of the moment lay not in the emotion of the speech, but in its structure. What followed the failed coup attempt was not spontaneous defiance. It was a carefully constructed declaration that redefined how power itself was framed. Traoré was not reacting to danger. He was redesigning the terrain on which danger usually operates. At the core of the declaration was a principle that has unsettled empires for centuries. Movements collapse when they are trapped inside individuals. African political history offers painful proof. Leaders are elevated, personalized, mythologized, and then removed. With them fall morale, organization, and momentum. Assassination succeeds not because it ends a life, but because it ends belief. Traoré confronted this pattern directly. He did not deny his mortality. He emphasized it. Breath, blood, fragility. These were not admissions of weakness. They were tools of detachment. By stating plainly that he could be killed, he stripped death of its strategic value. Violence depends on the promise of closure. He refused to provide it. This was where the speech crossed from rhetoric into design. Instead of asking the nation to gather around him, Traoré redirected attention toward collective awakening. Power, he argued, does not reside in a man, a uniform, or an office. It resides in understanding. When people recognize that their worth is inherent, domination loses efficiency. Control begins to fracture. Such framing is rare because it is dangerous to systems built on hierarchy. Most leaders reinforce their indispensability during crisis. Traoré did the opposite. He deliberately rendered himself replaceable. Politically, this is radical. A movement that can survive its founder is no longer vulnerable to decapitation. Remove the leader and nothing collapses. Coup logic disintegrates. The declaration also rejected fear as a governing instrument. For decades, African societies have been disciplined through warnings. Obey or suffer. Submit or be isolated. Comply or be punished. Traoré's response was direct. Burkina Faso had already endured suffering. Poverty, instability, and humiliation were no longer credible threats. When a population has little left to lose, fear loses leverage. What strengthened this argument was its refusal to romanticize struggle. He promised no comfort. He did not mask hardship. He reframed dignity as non-negotiable. A nation may struggle standing upright, he suggested, but a nation that kneels never rises. This distinction transformed endurance from desperation into choice. The speech also dismantled a quieter mechanism of control, the myth of isolation. Fear works best when people believe they stand alone. Traoré insisted on the opposite. Farmers, soldiers, students, workers were not rhetorical symbols. They were political reality. When individuals recognize themselves as part of a shared condition, intimidation loses its isolating force. Courage spreads. This was not an emotional call for unity. It was an operational insight. Fragmentation enables betrayal. When divisions close, infiltration becomes harder. Loyalty shifts from transactions to identity. Unity becomes not a moral slogan, but a strategic asset. The declaration also rejected the search for saviors. Traoré made it clear that the movement did not hinge on his survival. If he lived, he would serve. If he fell, others would rise. Leadership was no longer a seat to be defended, but a responsibility meant to multiply. In a region where politics has often revolved around irreplaceable figures, this marked a clean break from precedent. The broader consequences were unmistakable. External pressure depends on predictability. Sanctions, inducements, threats, and regime change strategies assume a central figure through whom influence flows. A leader who dissolves himself into collective awareness becomes difficult to coerce. When authority migrates from a person to an idea, leverage weakens. This is why the declaration resonated far beyond Burkina Faso. It was not merely a response to a failed coup. It was an announcement that old assumptions were being discarded. The belief that killing a leader ends a movement, that fear ensures obedience, and that dependency guarantees control was being challenged at its foundation. Yet words alone do not alter history. Ideas gain force only when they align with lived conditions. Inspiration does not equal protection. That reality raised a question many observers could not ignore. If this movement was no longer centered on one man, why had attempts to remove him failed at all? To understand the deeper meaning of the declaration, one must confront a truth often left unstated. The greatest threat to external control in Africa has never been military capacity. Armies can be trained, funded, sanctioned, or defeated. Weapons can be matched or neutralized. What resists containment is a shift in collective thinking. This was the nerve Traoré deliberately touched. The real anxiety for external powers is not African soldiers. It is African questions. When people begin to ask why their land is rich while their lives remain poor, when they question partnerships that promise progress but deliver little dignity, inherited structures begin to wobble. Systems built on compliance do not survive scrutiny. For decades, Africa's external relationships have been wrapped in technical language. Cooperation, assistance, stabilization. Beneath the vocabulary lies a simpler equation. Resources move outward. Dependency moves inward. Poverty is normalized as circumstance rather than consequence. Traoré stripped this arrangement of its politeness. He named imbalance without apology. By doing so, he reframed poverty as a political outcome rather than fate. Scarcity was no longer destiny. Underdevelopment was no longer failure. It was design. Once people recognize design, inevitability loses its grip. A population that stops blaming itself becomes unpredictable. It no longer negotiates from shame. It no longer accepts explanations that demand permanent inferiority. This is why thinking unsettles power more than firepower. Weapons challenge authority in one place. Ideas challenge it everywhere. When an entire generation internalizes this shift, traditional tactics lose effectiveness. Sanctions feel less absolute. Isolation feels less final. Even hardship takes on a different meaning when it is chosen rather than imposed. Traoré did not deny external pressure. He denied its moral authority. Relationships labeled as cooperation were exposed as conditional arrangements that preserved advantage for one side while demanding obedience from the other. When imbalance persists, calling it partnership becomes hollow. Renaming it does not alter its function. This critique struck at the core of a system that relies on African leaders acting as intermediaries rather than representatives. As long as leadership is rewarded for managing dependency, the structure holds. When leadership teaches populations to question dependency itself, the structure begins to fracture. Equally significant was how Traoré addressed fear. Historically, fear has been cultivated through forecasts of collapse, economic ruin, diplomatic isolation, and internal chaos. These warnings assume people believe they have something stable to lose. Traoré rejected that premise. Burkina Faso, he implied, had already experienced submission. The threat of suffering no longer carried weight, because suffering had been normalized for generations. Fear works only when it threatens removal. When dignity has already been compromised, fear loses bargaining power. What remains is resolve. Resolve does not require approval from outside. The declaration also challenged another quiet narrative. For decades, African youth have been taught that opportunity exists elsewhere, that fulfillment requires departure, and that worth is measured by acceptance abroad. Traoré confronted this directly. He spoke of a future anchored in the land itself, where value is not granted by visas or validation from foreign capitals. This was not isolation. It was reorientation. A society that believes its future must be authorized externally remains psychologically dependent even when politically independent. Breaking that dependency unsettles those accustomed to defining Africa's options. The speech did not name enemies. It exposed mechanisms. And exposure often threatens more than confrontation. When systems are named plainly, ambiguity dissolves. Questions spread. Silence becomes harder to enforce. Because of this, the response to such thinking is rarely direct. Instead of open debate, pressure shifts elsewhere. Markets react. Media narratives harden. Security concerns surface. The battlefield moves because the challenge is no longer one leader or one policy. It is a population beginning to think in ways that were never approved. Yet thinking alone does not sustain momentum. Ideas move faster when reinforced by experience, unity, and the sense that something deeper is holding the line. This is where the story moves beyond economics and diplomacy. When fear fails and awareness spreads, power searches for another entry point. Sometimes it discovers that the ground has already chosen a side. The failure of the recent coup attempt was not simply a matter of poor execution. It reflected a deeper miscalculation about where power now resides inside Burkina Faso. For decades, destabilization followed a familiar formula. Separate the armed forces from the population. Fracture society through suspicion. Present betrayal as profitable. This time, the formula did not hold. The decisive factor was unity, not as a slogan, but as lived political reality. The attempt exposed something planners had underestimated. The distance between soldiers and civilians had narrowed. The military was no longer viewed as a distant institution serving abstract interests. It was seen as part of the same social fabric under pressure. Farmers, workers, students, and troops were not responding as separate groups. They were responding as participants in a shared outcome. This alignment mattered more than weaponry. Coups succeed when institutions can be isolated from legitimacy. They fail when legitimacy moves faster than orders. Here, loyalty was not driven by rank or reward. It was driven by identification. Soldiers were not choosing between obedience and rebellion. They were choosing between the nation and transactions that no longer carried moral weight. This was not accidental. It reflected a shift in political messaging that existed before the coup attempt. Authority had begun to speak the language of dignity rather than fear. When leadership reframes power as shared ownership instead of coercion, incentives change. Betrayal becomes exposure. Silence becomes complicity. Public presence also mattered. When rumors of instability spread, people did not withdraw. They appeared. Streets filled not with panic, but with visibility. This matters because coups rely on ambiguity. They thrive when populations wait to see which direction power will tilt. Visibility collapses that waiting period. The message was clear. Any attempt to seize power without the people would have nowhere to land. No social vacuum. No quiet acceptance. No neutral ground. Unity removed the oxygen that coups require. Hardship did not translate into fragility. Years of endurance hardened collective patience. Short-term relief offered in exchange for long-term submission no longer appealed. Stability without dignity was revealed as another form of control. For younger generations, the moment carried special weight. It showed that agency does not require departure. Value does not need validation abroad. Participation at home, visible and collective, could shift outcomes. The future was no longer something to escape toward, but something to defend where it stood. What unfolded was not dramatic confrontation, but a closing of ranks. When the moment arrived, there was no confusion about loyalty. Without confusion, the coup had no momentum. Yet unity alone does not explain everything. Many leaders have fallen despite popular support. Many movements have stood together and still been broken. The question remains: if unity explains resistance, what explains survival? At this point, analysis enters territory often dismissed by outside observers. That dismissal reveals its own blind spot. Beyond weapons, alliances, and public alignment lies another layer of power that has shaped African political outcomes for centuries. Belief, not as superstition but as social force, as discipline, as psychological terrain. After the failed coup, narratives circulated within Burkina Faso that did not fit conventional security analysis. Traditional authorities, spiritual leaders, and custodians of ancestral practices were said to have convened, not to debate policy, but to reaffirm protection. To external audiences, such accounts sound symbolic or irrational. Internally, they function differently. The question is not whether rituals hold supernatural power. The question is what they do to fear. Every coup depends on psychological momentum. Before action begins, conspirators must believe success is possible. They must believe hesitation will be punished and betrayal rewarded. The population must believe resistance is futile. Once that belief fractures, plots leak, loyalties hesitate, and confidence erodes. This is where spiritual framing becomes strategically relevant. When a society believes its leadership is protected by history, ancestors, or forces larger than individuals, risk calculations change. Betrayal no longer feels clean. Conspiracy no longer feels invisible. Even the perception that the ground itself is watching introduces doubt. Doubt is fatal to covert operations. The idea of spiritual guardians should be read less as literal entities and more as a collective immune system. It signals vigilance, memory, the understanding that betrayal will not dissolve quietly. In environments where formal institutions are often penetrated, informal belief structures provide parallel deterrence. They cannot be sanctioned, bribed, or externally managed. This is the layer many external strategies overlook. When fear no longer belongs solely to the population, but begins to haunt those plotting in silence, the balance shifts. Crucially, this spiritual framing does not stand in opposition to modern governance. It exists alongside it. Roads are still constructed. Schools continue to function. Institutions operate. What changes is where legitimacy is anchored. It is no longer borrowed solely from systems modeled elsewhere. It is rooted in cultural continuity, in the sense that the present is connected to a longer historical line. This synthesis unsettles systems accustomed to dealing only in measurable power. Budgets can be negotiated. Governments can be pressured. Economies can be isolated. Shared belief cannot be dismantled so easily. When a population holds the conviction that resistance is protected by something deeper than the state, conventional levers lose precision. This is why survival in this case cannot be explained by security arrangements alone. When a leader becomes more than a political actor, when he functions as a signal carried by unity, history, and belief, removing him no longer guarantees control. It ensures only that something else will emerge. This is the moment when power realizes it is no longer confronting an individual, but a society remembering itself. What has unfolded in Burkina Faso is not the story of an untouchable leader. It is the story of a disruptive idea becoming ordinary. Traoré has not presented himself as a savior or as someone above history. He has done something more consequential. He has treated leadership as temporary and dignity as permanent. That distinction alters everything. For generations, Africa has been told that stability requires obedience, that development arrives with conditions, and that sovereignty must be negotiated quietly and externally. When a society stops accepting these premises, the architecture of control begins to strain. What is unfolding in Burkina Faso is not defiance for its own sake. It is reorientation, a refusal to measure worth through fear or permission. The repeated survival of Traoré is not, at its core, a mystery of security. It reflects alignment between words and lived experience, between the military and the population, between modern ambition and ancestral memory. Within this alignment, legitimacy stops being fragile. This is where the role of African spiritual authorities must be understood accurately, not as figures outside politics, but as custodians of continuity within society. They reinforce confidence where institutions alone often fall short. They remind people that the present struggle is neither isolated nor accidental, but part of a longer lineage. In a world fixated on visible power, this invisible reinforcement is often misunderstood and underestimated. Yet its effects are real. When people no longer believe their future requires external approval, psychological leverage weakens. When youth imagine dignity at home instead of opportunity elsewhere, dependency erodes. When leadership teaches that no single life stands between a nation and its destiny, fear loses its final advantage. This is not an invitation to idolize a man. It is a call to recognize a moment. History rarely announces itself politely. It emerges when assumptions fail. It moves when people decide humiliation is no longer sustainable, silence is no longer safe, and standing upright is worth the cost. If this story holds attention, it is because it is not confined to Burkina Faso. It raises a wider question, one that reaches beyond borders and headlines. What happens when people remember who they are and refuse to forget again? The answer is still forming. And whether the world is prepared or not, it will have to watch. Not because it was invited, but because movements grounded in awareness do not wait for permission.